the idea that it would have this massive impact, I think, is unlikely. The government are kind of tied to it because it's been their sort of flagship policy for so long. But a bit like, their national insurance cut, they do it once, it doesn't make a difference to the polls. They've done it a second time, it hasn't made a difference. I'm not sure this is going to have the kind of the poll bounce that they're really hoping for
Yeah.
either.
It's so difficult, isn't it, Alan, when you hear somebody like Jamal talk about the loyalty that they have had to this country, but the incredibly difficult reception that members of their family might have had from this country. Can you talk us through what we might expect in Parliament later, just to do with that?
The one that's being pushed and will continue to be pushed by the peers. And there is a number of MPs who clearly think that actually the government should back this amendment, but the government appears to be in no mood to push back. Actually, we heard the Deputy Foreign Secretary Andrew Mitchell earlier this morning saying that this amendment was not necessary because there is an existing scheme, which you heard talked about there, the Arab scheme for Afghan citizens. This amendment is not necessary because people at Afghan interpreters would already be covered. Obviously, the examples that we're hearing show that actually there are lots of people slipping through the net, and that is why this amendment would be needed to cover those. But I think the government is very keen to get this legislation wrapped up by the end of today, which basically means continuing to overturn this until eventually the Lords kind of relent and the bill can pass. So currently, MPs are discussing the last time the peers amended the legislation last week. That's going to be overturned. It will go back to the Lords this afternoon and potentially back and forth a couple more times. One MP, Tim Lawton, said that he's brought his sleeping bag, so that would give you an idea of how long they expect this to go on to this evening.
Right. And is it true to say, though, that actually this could go on for even longer, but the Labour Party doesn't want to insist on that happening because they fear it creates a precedent that they might then be on the receiving end of were they to get into power?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that the Lords are starting to come under a bit of pressure now. There's a number of articles today saying that the Lords have kind of they've tested this, they've pushed it a number of times. They've referred the legislation back to the Commons. Eventually, their job is to relent because they are the unelected second chamber. They're a revising chamber. They're not the one that sets legislation, and they should eventually relent. And also, there's a bit of pushback. Clearly, the Conservatives are blaming Labour for the delay in this bill being passed through. Michael Tomlinson, the immigration minister, just said in the Commons, Labour have blocked this 134 times. So clearly, I think eventually Labour wants to kind of relent. They don't want to be so necessarily be blamed for this. They want to kind of they think this policy is going to fail on its own terms. They don't necessarily want to be the ones who are sort of blamed for it, really.
And Alan, what do you think the actual visuals eventually do look like when we are treated to pictures of planes taking off? I mean, it's become quite a well-worn phrase, that, hasn't it? That the government wants to see planes taking off. But
Mm.
do you think that that will really make a difference in terms of the government's poll ratings, in terms of where the government stands on being judged for its immigration policy?
Mm. Well, it's become so totemic for them, but I think for the government, the problem is that the people who really want the Rwanda planes to take off, or really want to see the planes taking off, are potentially people who are already within the tent. Whether this is going to start bringing over voters who have switched to Labour, I think it's hard to judge really. And I think also the fact is that even if they got planes going in the PM sounded quite optimistic about getting them perhaps in July and a schedule of planes, ahead of perhaps an election in the autumn. That would still only be a few hundred, perhaps into the thousands. The total people who arrived in small boats last year was around 30,000. The year before that, it was 45,000, run for a record figure potentially this year, especially if we now have quite a warm summer. So the idea that it would have this massive impact, I think, is unlikely. The government are kind of tied to it because it's been their sort of flagship policy for so long. But a bit like, their national insurance cut, they do it once, it doesn't make a difference to the polls. They've done it a second time, it hasn't made a difference. I'm not sure this is going to have the kind of the poll bounce that they're really hoping for
Yeah.
either.
Let's talk about some other stuff around today, crime data in particular. Less than half of the public trust the police to solve crimes. It's a very stark new YouGov poll. I mean, that is just so difficult, isn't it, on a personal and individual basis, because what that means is that people in a time of absolute crisis are no longer feeling that there is something out there, a body of people to whom they can immediately turn, whether or not a crime is eventually solved, can in that moment offer them some kind of security. That's a very, very difficult thing, isn't it, Anna?
Absolutely. And I think when trust is lost in something like policing, it's very, very hard to get back. We've had for hundreds of years in this country the concept of policing by consent. We tend to have fairly light touch policing, but there's an understanding that the police are there when you need them to protect you, to solve a crime when you've been a victim. And if people that is chipped away, which it has been through, through various kind of high profile incidents, but also through the fact is that cuts to police numbers mean that actually there have been less crimes being solved. There's part of the Times crime commission that you're referring to talks about kind of about 80% of shoplifting offences are not even attended by a police, which effectively means that it's decriminalized. That kind of it's very hard to win back that trust when people see over a course of time various things just not even being looked at, not even being attempted to be solved and fixed.
Yeah. And the figures are really damaging, aren't they? Only 20% of people believe the police would arrest and prosecute someone if they were burgled. Just 7% are confident that a pickpocket would be caught. Over a third think it's unlikely that the perpetrator would be arrested and prosecuted if they reported a sexual assault. And earlier on the programme, we were talking about victims of stalking, and only 1.7 of reported stalking incidents actually get to a successful prosecution. So these are very, very damning figures. But when policing raises its head in a political way ahead of an election, we are going to hear what, Anna? I mean, the same
Mm.
promises of more police on the beat? Will we hear anything different? I mean, this is, I think, a substantially more serious level of fear amongst the public than we have had in previous elections.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And if you remember, Boris Johnson's campaign, successful campaign in 2019, was based around four things. It was getting Brexit done, and it was levelling up, it was building 40 new hospitals, and it was hiring 20,000 new police officers. And he gave a big speech in front of a row of police cadets, and it was a big part of their campaign. And it was clearly a big vote winner with people who felt that they wanted more bobbies on the beat, who wanted more community policing, who wanted a visible kind of police presence. Obviously, they did hit that target last year. But the fact is that we're still seeing, a growing distrust in policing. So therefore, I think we're going to have to see probably from both parties pledges to hire more police officers. I think perhaps in the short term as well. We know that in London there's been a lot of criticism of the way the Met has been operating in the policing. So I think although the Tories are on the back foot nationally, I can definitely see them, criticizing Labour. Sadiq Khan, who is restanding to become mayor and has obviously partly operational control over the Met. So I think there'll be definitely in the last few weeks of the mayoral campaign there'll be a big focus on policing in London. But over the course of the next few months of policing will become a larger issue, I think, in the general election. And yeah, it's probably I think most people just want to see more of it, want to see more crimes solved, and more of a kind of an understanding of how serious actually what even seems like minor crimes like pickpocketing or shoplifting, how seriously people find them.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I'm surprised it's 7% who feel confident a pickpocket would be caught. I would have thought it's probably closer to one. Alan, it's
People
good
are
to
still
talk to
optimistic.
you. Well, yes, I mean, let's not take away hope in our hearts. Alan is the chief reporter and podcast host for Politics Home.
I was interested in what he said about what will happen in voters' minds when they see the imagery around those flights to Rwanda. Because I think, although some supporters of the policy will be highly delighted, I think others will be troubled or find it. Or I mean, we don't know what it's going to look like, do we?
I think they're quite strange optics. I mean, I
Yeah.
completely understand the arguments behind needing to find
Look, yeah,
something
I get that.
smashes the gangs. We understand that completely, but there will be nothing in that imagery that puts a face on a gang member. There'll be nothing in that imagery that actually talks about what happens when people try and cross a small piece of ocean. It's a very different optic that we're going to see.
Well,
Just
presumably.
a plane going, take the problem over there.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Jane.
Well, we don't know
Let's
what we
keep an
will
open
see.
mind here.
But at its worst, we might just see a lot of people being led against their will onto a plane from Britain to
Well, I
somewhere
think also
they
the
don't
point
want
is
to be.
actually not very many people.
Or not very many. Well, maybe 15.
Yeah.
I mean, it's all just a deeply peculiar set of circumstances. But I absolutely take your point. Clearly, something needs to be done about the people smugglers. There's no doubt about that.